my own inability to divorce the spiritual from the intellectual, and my own inability to really embody a secular mode of knowing, which was never meant for me. As a Black Muslim, secularism was never meant for me, okay? It was never meant for people who look like me, people who have names that sound like me. And by me, I mean the people that I represent and the traditions that I represent. And just being able to name for myself how I stand in opposition, resistance, defiance, explicitly and implicitly, has been one of the most clarifying things in my intellectual journey. Welcome back, everyone. It is your host, Iman. And today I am finding grounding in intentionality and in celebration. I'm coming off of just the other day, because my flight was so delayed getting back home, I ended up spending an extra day in Chicago where I was celebrating my best friend from high school who was getting married. I just had such a lovely weekend with friends and such a lovely weekend with women that I have known since I was 11 and 12 years old, and getting to hang out with them and re-meet in a lot of ways new versions of them in their adult selves, them getting to meet new versions of me, and just coming together intentionally to celebrate a friend who brings so much light into our lives in this special moment that she is going through. And it just left me feeling so good this weekend and has made me feel really grateful. I'm having a very different kind of summer than I normally would have. I'm so used to my summers when I was in New Haven in grad school, kind of always surrounded by like big group hangouts. And I've had a lot of intentional one-on-one friendship moments this summer. To just be in a space where it was like a big group, it felt very healing and such a reminder that group friend dynamics can feel so fun. And it just did a lot for me. And it also made me think like healing really does happen in community. I'm in a time in my life where I've had some fracture and some pretty significant friendships, and just being back with old friends just really felt very healing to me, and very healing that friendships, I don't want to say friendships come and go, but relationships ebb and flow. And I think that is just something I keep repeating this summer, because navigating adult friendships is really hard. And so just these past couple of weeks, I've been going through a real fracture and a real pain point. So to just have so much joy this weekend with old friends, I'm actually getting ready to get on a flight to do a group vacation with other friends that we do annually. And it's just been so nice because I've been working really hard this summer. I'm truly on vacation these next 11 days, and I'm recording this in between group hangouts with people that I really love and adore. And again, it just feels very healing to the more kind of painful parts of friendship that I've been experiencing, not just over these past few weeks, but really over the past year or so. So it just feels nice to feel like I'm turning a new leaf and on the other side of that. But that is actually not a very good segue, because we're just going to jump right into it, because I still want to answer the question, which is our grounding question of the day, which is, what is secularism? Now, secularism is one of those words where a lot of people will say it and assume that they're talking about the same thing when they're talking about so many different things. This is a way to intellectualize your life, and a way to really enhance your critical thinking is to be able to identify that when people use one particular word and they think that they're meaning the same thing, and they actually mean so many different things, even though they're using the same word. So some people think of secularism as the separation of church and state. Some scholars think of secularism as an ideology, meaning it is a dominant form of thinking that is institutionalized, that people who are on the outside of it experience violence and trauma, that it is something that is all encompassing. It is something that does not welcome other things. So people think of secularism as an ideology. Some scholars think of secularism as a religion in and of itself. Some people think of secularism as just simply everything that exists outside of quote unquote institutionalized religion. So it is the secular. If it is, let's say, music that is not gospel music, people will talk about secular music, music that doesn't explicitly have to do with anything that relates to, religion or God in the kind of capital God, capital R religion way. And then some people think about secularism as myths, right? That this idea that there is a religious world and a secular world, and that those two things are separate. Like, for example, the idea that this tree outside of my window that I'm looking at is that there's a secular version of this tree and then a spiritual version of this tree. A lot of people put science in the realm of meaning those things that don't have anything to do with religion. So people divorce science and religion so that you can look at, let's say, I always tell my students, you can look at the skeleton. I very oddly was teaching religion classes in a science classroom on campus last semester. And we had this model skeleton, the ones that hang from the kind of ruler hanger. And I would ask them, when did this skeleton and this representation of this skeleton come to symbolize science and not the religious or the spiritual? And so people think of the secular, right, as the separation of all things, science from all things religious. All that to say is there is so much theorization around what the secular is and what secularism is. So much so, one of my favorite quotes from a scholar of the secular, who is Talal Asad, is he says that the secular is actually one of those things that is best studied indirectly, meaning you can really get a sense of what secularism is by studying other things. And that might seem a little opaque, but I think that is really onto something pedagogically, meaning when he says that the secular is best studied indirectly, I find that as a scholar of religion, as somebody who has spent a lot of time thinking about the secular, I find bringing people in to this conversation about what is the secular, the best way isn't giving them a singular definition of what the secular is. Again, because there's so many different definitions. I find that the best way of getting people to see the secular and secularism is by identifying assumptions. So, like I said, there are people who identify secularism as a religion of itself. There are people who identify secularism as myths. There are people who identify secularism as all things outside of religion. There are people who identify the secular as all things science. I personally like to get people thinking about what is the secular by thinking about the kinds of assumptions that circulate and determine our life. I find when you can start identifying what is supposedly common sense and what you assume is the only way of being or the right way of being, then you start getting into what the secular is. So that is really abstract, but I want to bring this down because even for myself, I learned something new about the secular every day. Actually, getting acquainted with what I actually truly did not understand theoretically, how much my own being, thinking, upbringing, the traditions I was studying and raised in, and how I thought about what it meant to study those traditions. For me, showing up then in grad school at a place like Yale, I was then confronted with what exactly the secular is, because it challenged the assumptions that I had with what I realized were the secular assumptions of others, or the secular assumptions I was just picking up in the world. And this actually started well before grad school, like college, right? College and elite liberal arts universities tend to be like institutions par excellence for how to be a proper secular subject. This is our very first conversation directly on what the secular is. We're going to have so many conversations on what the secular is, but I wanted to walk you through it by walking you through my own assumptions and the assumptions that I encountered from others as it related to my scholarship and what I thought it meant to be an intellectual and a scholar in this world. The assumptions that I had versus assumptions that I were confronted by others, what I've held on to, and what have you. And before we do that, what I will say is being able to see the ways that I have resisted my own secularization across my own intellectual journey has brought into such sharp relief how I see intellectual life, how I see scholarship as, for example, there being no distinction between the spiritual and the intellectual. Being able to say that, see that, and understand how that resists common sense assumptions of knowledge has been a journey that I'm still on. One that I did not realize and see myself as being so completely in until after I finished my dissertation, truly, has just been the most clarifying and self-reflective parts of this whole intellectual scholarly journey. And I say that because my own inability to divorce the spiritual from the intellectual and my own inability to really embody a secular mode of knowing, which was never meant for me. As a Black Muslim, secularism was never meant for me, okay? It was never meant for people who look like me, people who have names that sound like me. That secularism was never meant to include me, right? And by me, I mean the people that I represent and the traditions that I represent. And just being able to name for myself how I stand in opposition, resistance, defiance, explicitly and implicitly to that, has been one of the most clarifying things in my intellectual journey and is something that I'm still seeking clarity on. So let's get at the very first assumption that I encountered in grad school. I had no idea until college, really. And then truly, you really get a sense of this in grad school. How? As long as academic disciplines basically have existed, as long as the study of religion has existed, and the study of religion is actually at the center of modern academia as we know it. I had no idea that people thought that in order to have a real grasp on the thing that you're studying, you need to be outside of it. Now, this is a discourse that is slowly changing, but it is still the prevailing assumption. And I say assumption because is that true? Is it true that in order to have a good grasp on something, a good grasp on a particular tradition, that you need to be outside of it? Now, true is a subjective word, but does that sound useful to you? Is that how you've seen knowledge modeled throughout your life? For me, I had no idea that my explicit identity as a Black Muslim, and I say Black Muslim because I use those two words together and as giving each other meaning, as in my Blackness gives my Islam and my Muslimness meaning and my Muslimness gives my Blackness meaning. So I'm always going to say I'm not just Muslim, I'm a Black Muslim. I had no idea that because I'm also a part of that tradition, right? I am a part of the history of Islam in America. My people are a part of the history of Islam in America. My ancestors are a part of the history of Islam in America. But I had no idea that people thought until I went to grad school that actually being outside of that, not being a daughter of it, a granddaughter of it, but being a spectator of it, actually gave you more academic bona fides to study something and to be an expert on this thing than the person that actually comes from the tradition. Now you might be like, whoa, I had no idea people thought that. But let me tell you, that is 100% the prevailing discourse, that in order to really study something, you have to be outside of it. That is an assumption. Is that everyone's truth? Is that a truth? No, it's a truth to some people and not to others. But it is certainly an assumption. I had no idea, truly, that people thought that way until I got to college. And so that is a particular understanding of expertise, that you have to be outside of something in order to have an expertise on it. And throughout my academic journey, I have just always felt very resistant to that. I've always felt very resistant to the fact that how can I study and write about this Black Muslim tradition? How can I study and write about Black Muslim thought without being self-reflective on how my own occupation of those identities, how my own occupation of those traditions informs how I'm able to see what that tradition means to the Black Muslim thinkers that I study. So it's different understandings of expertise. And those are all assumptions. That is a common sense understanding of the secular, that you have to be outside of something in order to be an expert in it. Now, again, this is something that is being picked away at by lots of folks. But it is still the prevailing assumption. Let's please not get it twisted. Or let's say if you're a white scholar who is studying the Islamic tradition, you're seen as having a particular kind of scientific understanding of what Islam is and what Muslims are, rather than an insider corrupted way. And I use those words intentionally, but that is how the secular operates. The secular operates by prioritizing certain relationships to knowledge and certain knowledge over others. So the outsider of a tradition, someone who does not occupy the positionality or the lived experience of the thing that they're studying, is somehow seen as having more knowledge and more expertise than somebody actually living it. That is a secular assumption. That is how the secular plays out in determining who is considered an expert and who is considered knowledgeable and whose knowledge is considered valuable. So that is one assumption that I encountered. And I did not realize when I was encountering that assumption, I was encountering the secular. A second secular assumption that I encountered in grad school is I realized I was hearing lots of the same stories about the people that I studied over and over again. This wasn't just in grad school, this was in college. Growing up as a kid in a post 9/11 context, you encounter the secular when you encounter the stories that people tell over and over again. And then when you become a scholar, the stories and the histories people want you to tell over and over again. Which stories are seen as just true because people have heard them before. So many people want a book and want histories of Muslim women, and they want you to talk about what their dress and clothes mean. They want you to talk about the hijab. They want you to talk about the niqab. They want you to talk about veiling. Those are histories that people want. Those are histories when you say, I am writing a history about Black Muslim women and their embodied knowledge, and not just embodied knowledge in their dress, but intuition, channeling, and things like that. They're like, yeah, but like, why don't you have a chapter on dress? Why don't you have a chapter on why none of these women that you study like wore hijab or were visibly Muslim in the way that you think they are? So again, mind you though, I'm growing up, I see Muslim women. There's no singular dress aesthetic of any Muslim, right? Layla Ahmed and Sylvia Chin Malik also has a really good chapter on this. And they both talk about how this discourse on the veil, which is this idea that the hijab or the veil became the cultural identifier of Islam, actually started 1979 post the Iranian Revolution. We don't need to get into the details, but all I'm saying is that the assumption that Islam and Muslim women equal the veil is not something that has existed across time and space. It is actually a very modern phenomenon, right? 1979. So all that to say is this synonymization of Muslim women with the veil is new, but there's an assumption that if you say you write histories about Muslim women, then you've got a book chapter and an article on veiling and what Muslim women wear. That's the prevailing assumption. And when you encounter that prevailing assumption, then you're also encountering secularism, because that is a secular history of Muslim women. That is the kind of history that people want to hear over and over again, because it is a history that has been fetishized by white culture. It has been used to symbolize Islam's backwardness, Muslim women's oppression, so on and so on. And so you encounter the secular when you encounter all of the assumptions that people think they know about the thing that you're studying. So when you then say, well, actually, I don't care about that, I literally say to this day, assigning discourse on the veil that talks about how the hijab and the veil have been overrepresented as cultural symbols of Islam, that is as close as I will ever get to assigning anything in my classes, or I'm definitely never writing anything about it. That is the closest you will get to any Women in Islam or Intro to Islam class that talks about the hijab, because it is a history that people have heard so much you don't need to encounter it in my classrooms, because it is a secular narrative. It is an assumption. And so when you come to my class and you don't get that, and students are frequently like, oh, I didn't think I was going to be learning about this in your class, we are challenging secular assumptions, right? So again, you encounter the secular when you encounter the kinds of histories people want you to tell about something, or the kind of histories that you're used to hearing or always used to hearing. For example, people always want a Black history that is grounded in the transatlantic slave trade. Now, this is not to say that we don't live in the wake of the transatlantic slavery and all Black history is connected to this, sure. But people always, if you say you study Black history, and the thing people also want to pay you to talk about the most is slavery. That's what people want you to talk about. And so when you're a scholar of Black history, that is actually like, I'm not going to talk about explicitly in the way you want me to slavery. I'm not going to explicitly talk about Black violence in the way that you want me to. For example, I talk about Black nationalism. I would talk about Black self-defense. I talk about the Black people who explicitly do not make it into history books because they were critiquing the conservatism of Black thinkers that do, right? So I'm setting a very particular group of people, a particular group of thinkers. Those are not the assumptive histories that people want to hear. People don't want to hear histories about Black folks rising up and giving back the same violence that they have experienced. People don't want to hear those histories. So again, you encounter the secular when you encounter the kinds of histories that people want you to tell, whether it be Black histories about slavery, or whether that be Black histories that are exclusively reduced to Black violence and exclusively reduced to Black slavery, and particularly chattel slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, whether that be exclusively wanting histories and scholarship on Muslim women to always have a chapter on veiling, always have a chapter on the hijab, always have 6 weeks on the syllabus dedicated to dress. Those are all secular assumptions. We encounter the secular when we encounter these kind of common sense. So when I got to grad school, when I started teaching all of these things, I started realizing I was encountering the secular when I was encountering common sense notions of things. Another thing that I realized when I was encountering the secular in grad school in particular, and I did not realize that this is what I have held on to and what I feel continues to distinguish me from certain people, and also what unites me with a lot more people. And that is the idea that there is no separation between the spiritual and the intellectual. And so I mean this also at the level of professors and scholars and why it is we do what we do. I have found most community with scholars, academics, professors. As a matter of fact, not just my profession, a lot of people in their professions think this way, who see the pursuit of knowledge as spiritual and who see the pursuit of what we do as transformative and spiritually transformative, that see an intellectual life as a spiritual life. I have found my people because I have found people who see what we do in that way. But that is not the prevailing way. That is, and it relates back to the first assumption on this idea that in order to be an expert on something, you have to be outside of it, right? To say that actually the thinker that I am studying is changing how I see the world. Oh my God, this is making me think. My best friend, who I celebrated this weekend, recommended to me that I watch this movie called The Arrival. And this movie, The Arrival, it has Forrest Whitaker in it and Amy Adams, is about aliens who land on Earth, and they basically have a gift that they want to give humans, but the humans don't know what the gift is because they can't speak the same language as the aliens. And so the movie follows this linguist, this professor of linguistics, who is trying to understand the language and comes to understand it. And so she's able to, oh my God, what is the principle called? And the movie is based around this principle that when you start to learn somebody's language, it fundamentally rewires your brain and changes how you see the world. Meaning, when I learn Arabic or Spanish, not only am I learning how to communicate differently, but when you start studying that language, then you begin to see the world differently because you have new terms and new concepts, right? And so the connection that I'm trying to make here is that I have found kin most closely with people who realize that when you spend 10 years studying, let's say, 20th century Black nationalist thought, when you spend 10 years studying the Islamic philosophical and theological tradition, when you spend 10 years thinking with and studying Black women who have seen and held on to a deeply spiritual sense of the world as it is, you begin to change how you see the world because you're learning their language. It's a different language than the language you learn growing up and in schools. It's a different language than the secular histories you're told. And so for me, that this assumption that what we do and who we study and who we think with isn't deeply transformative, isn't both spiritual and intellectual, that was a particular assumption. And I have found my kin and my community with people who realize that actually this stuff, this profession changes you. And not just changes, how you write about a history, but changes how you show up in the world, how you think about the world, the kind of friend you want to be, the kind of leader you want to be. And that is a challenge to the secular assumption that there's a distinction between the spiritual and the intellectual, that there's a distinction between the scientist and the thing that is being studied. And that was a real assumption that I've encountered. And this is a really recent phenomenon, right? The highest educated people up until not even 100 years ago were almost always people who had an explicit religious affiliation. For the majority of written human existence, the highest educated people have always been priests, clergy, and what have you, meaning that they have always seen the pursuit and seeking of knowledge as deeply spiritual. So being able to identify that, okay, my people are the people who see the spiritual and the intellectual as one and the same, that has been so deeply clarifying because and has been so easy to like form community around in grad school and in this knowledge economy, that you don't see knowledge as just like a way to capitalize and make money, or knowledge as a way to show off your expertise and always have a sense of knowing. But no, you find this work of study in this life of the mind as deeply spiritual, transformative of your ethics, how you see yourself, right? You're learning a new language, so therefore you're able to see the world differently. And oh my gosh, I like literally wish I could pick up my phone right now, but I use my phone to record to talk about the principle, right? But it's this principle: when you learn a new language, it fundamentally changes how you see the world. You don't just learn a new way to communicate, you learn a new way of seeing. And that is how I have always seen academia and the study of Black history, the study of Black women's spirituality, and the study of Islam as changing how I see the world, not just me wanting to possess expertise over a particular field or perform a sense of knowing. And I'll bring this into the last point of kind of a secular assumption: feeling personally transformed by the people that you think with as a scholar of religion, because the people that you think with are considered religious subjects. Being able to see religious quote unquote subjects, or I hate this word, followers or members, as thinkers also challenges secular assumptions. Meaning, I had no idea that people saw people who explicitly identified as religious or thinking with religion or whatever as somehow not intelligent. This also has a very, very deep-rooted anti-Black history, because a huge part of justifying Black enslavement during the transatlantic slave trade and during the height of the Enlightenment era was to say that Black people had an innate religiosity, were over-emotional, meaning that Black people were way too religious to ever possess the reason and the rationality and the enlightenment that would make them true thinkers. And that is how white folks intellectually distinguish, quote unquote, the Negro from the human. So again, this idea that people who are considered religious are not considered thinkers, or not considered rational, capable of reason, that has a deeply anti-Black history. But now, in this contemporary moment, when people identify religious subjects or religious followers or religious members as people who are just following a leader, or who are not intellectuals themselves, they are replicating that discourse. And so you encounter secular assumptions, particularly as a scholar of religion, when you start talking about your work and the people that you think with outside of the field of religion. They're like, well, like, why are you studying those crazy people? Like, I always say, like, being in New York, the people that I study are on the corner, probably handing out some flyers or selling bean pies or what have you, or in a root working shop, some kind of psychic consultant. Why are you studying those people when you could be studying people, Black folks who went to Juilliard? This is a very common assumption of like a distinguishing between the arts and religion and spirituality. But all that to say is people are way more capable of seeing a Black artist, for example, as being a thinker than they are as seeing a quote religious subject or religious follower as also being a thinker. So again, challenging the assumption that people who explicitly, or who are read as being explicitly religious, because let's be very clear, two women walk into a room in a suit, one of them is white, the other is Black with a hijab. They both can have very different politics. They both can have the same exact politics in their approach to religion in the public sphere, but only one of those women is going to be read as secular. The other, regardless of what she says, is not going to be read as secular. Right? So again, secularism has never been meant for everyone. But this idea that folks who are seen as religious, folks who are seen as spiritual, folks who are seen as not abiding by secularism or secularism's common sense are also thinkers and also intellectuals, that is something that also challenges secular assumptions. So that is kind of the last secular assumption that I'm going to add on today, because I also have to finish packing. But just to run through, right? The secular is a lot of things. You can Google the secular and find so many different definitions. You can get 6 scholars of religion in a room and ask them each to tell you what secularism is, and I guarantee you they're all going to have different answers. For our first conversation on what is secularism, I wanted to walk you all through secularism as assumptions. Secularism, I wanted to walk you through this idea that we best understand secularism by looking at the kinds of assumptions and common senses that we encountered. And I wanted to walk you through that through my own lived experience of the kind of assumptions and common sense I encountered as a Black Muslimah scholar of Black women's spirituality in Islam, and as a daughter, granddaughter, and great-granddaughter of those traditions, the kinds of things and assumptions that I encountered, because it was through encountering those assumptions and naming them and being able to understand them as assumptions. Because initially, when you're young and impressionable and new to a space, you perceive them as your own difference. I was like, oh my God, I'm just like really different, or I don't get something. That has been a huge part. I know that I am encountering the secular when I enter a space and I am just sitting there and being like, wait, I don't get something. Everyone in here is getting something that I don't get. They're on the same page and understanding something that I just don't know. And being able to be like, I don't understand what's going on here is a huge resistance to the secular. Just being like, I don't understand what's going on here, because it challenges a common sense understanding. I think next week we're also going to get a little more deep dive into this, because now I'm feeling like, okay, we need a what is secularism part 2. So we're definitely going to do that the following week. But this is the starting part of the conversation, starting with my own lived experience around my own intellectual journey in terms of thinking about secularism as the kinds of assumptions. So I want you to go out in the world and think about the kinds of assumptions that you encounter and the kinds of dominant forms of knowledge that you encounter. And then let's see where we're at. Let's see how the secular manifests if you're in corporate America. Let's see how the secular manifests if you are a public school teacher. Let's see how the secular manifests if you are a social worker. Tell me, comment, please let me know. And so I'm just going to end this today that I'm feeling grounded in, you know what? I'll actually say this as a prayer. I'm trying really deeply to find grounding in my body. I mentioned before, like I just like am really struggling with PMOS, and things have been feeling better internally. But yeah, I'm just like, it's just relationships to your body are like such new things. As I'm about to go on vacation in the summer is also a hard time, right? Like for bodies and what have you, that I am going to just keep trying to find grounding in my body. And so with that, you can follow me at I am ANABDK on all social media. You can send me a question that you would like me to answer by DMing me on the social platforms or emailing me at groundedwithdriman. Love you guys, and I'll see you here next Monday.